change that we can find. And we dig all the way in on a particular system. This week, in fact, we talk about COVID and coronavirus. So make sure you check out System Check this week. Our remarkable guests help us understand how systems work, why they don't work for all of us, and how to disrupt, reimagine, and transform them. System Check is all about bringing you authentic, expert voices to analyze, historicize, and diagnose the systems that shape our lives. And together, Melissa and I are learning how these systems might work together, how they might work in terms of designed to create inequality, but also how they might work when we reimagine and transform them. And so with you, our listeners, together we are searching for tools to repair all the country's harmful systems while we're doing that reimagining.
And listen, Dorian, here's what I'm not going to get mushy, especially this early in the broadcast, but 2020 has been like the worst year ever in so many different ways, just the worst. But, even as I was reflecting as we're coming to the end of the year, the truth is I can't completely hate it. There have been some good moments, some graceful moments. And one of them has been that I have just loved every minute of hosting this podcast with you. It has been kind of incredible how much ground we've covered in just 2 months. So let's see, we dug into the system of how we cast our votes and how we count our votes. We asked the question, why are people poor? And then also the question of how can we alleviate poverty? We traveled digitally, of course, down to Georgia. And we I think that's still my favorite episode. I love those folks that we talked to. We even had that opportunity to talk about why and how presidential transitions matter for ordinary people. And as you just pointed out, we just wrapped a 2-episode series about COVID-19. And in our first episode around that, we checked in on the system of public health. And then this week, we just did some work trying to expand the definition of what it means to find a cure. And then if you can remember, just over a month ago, we hosted a 5-hour live election night.
5 hours on election night. And I'm still trying to catch up on sleep, even though I know that's impossible. But yes, Melissa, we have done a lot. And tonight we're going to do a little bit more with this event. We hope we won't go 5 hours. We're saying, maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2, we'll see. But it's so exciting and we want to welcome you to the very first System Check book club. Now, you might be asking yourself, why a book club? And it's because the most important system we have is the system of ideas. And we want to take a little time to talk with some of the authors who are reshaping the world of ideas for the better.
And I'll also point out that, of course, it's the holiday season. And Dorian, one of my favorite gifts to give and to receive is a good book, or even like a whole series of books. I'm a book fanatic.
I love books. If you can't tell behind me, I love to get a great book. And, I am quite talented at knowing what's the perfect book to give as a gift. And we'll have some suggestions for you throughout the show around some great holiday gifts from the New York Public Library and some other places. So for everyone watching, Melissa and I are sure that this System Check book club and the picks that we're going to be talking about are the ideal last minute presents to yourself or to someone very nerdy in your life.
That's right. Give books. And right now, Dorian, I don't want to waste any more time because
let's get in it.
Guest is already here, and I'm ridiculously ready to talk to her about this book. So please welcome our very first guest, Maria Hinojosa. As, of course, you already know, Maria Hinojosa is a groundbreaking journalist. She's a storyteller. She's the founder of Futuro Media Group. She's an anchor, executive producer. She is an Emmy award-winning host of Maria Hinojosa One-on-One. She's won a Murrow Award and a Peabody. And this latest book, Once I Was You, a memoir of love and hate in a torn America, was published by Atria Books and received incredibly well-earned rave reviews. Maria, thank you for joining System Check.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to be with you. Mwah! Congratulations for all of the work that the both of you are doing. I'm just so honored to be here with you, talking books.
And this is just about talking about your book, but all the things that your book is doing. So just start with the title, because the title, so what does it mean when you say Once I Was You?
So I don't know about other authors. Maybe they start a book with a title, but I didn't have a title. And we didn't have a title for a long it was getting a little bit crazy. I was getting really scared and nervous. And both my editor and my agent were like, no, don't worry, it will happen. And I was like, "Wah!" And we had somebody else come in and just start reading the book. And that editor was the one who said, what about Once I Was You? And I was like, oh my God. Here's the thing. I wrote the whole book, and then my editor, Michelle Herrera Mulligan, fabulous Mexican Irish from Chicago. Yes. After I wrote the book, she said, okay, go back and write the introduction. And I was like, you're kidding me, right? Like you're killing me here. Because you write a book and you have a sense of the book. And then I had to write this introductory chapter. And Sandra Cisneros, also from Chicago, great Mexican-American writer, said to me, she's one of my muses and friends, and she said, don't always write about what you remember, write about what you wish you could forget, or what you've already tried to forget. And when I sat with that, that was the scene that I decided, which was a scene from an airport in McAllen, Texas, where I witness, like maybe the both of you or people who are watching may have, if you sit back and you think, oh, I saw this really weird thing at the airport one time. A group of kids that should have looked like they were a soccer team, but they didn't look like they were a soccer team, and they didn't look happy, and they all looked mismatched, and none of them were talking. Well, I came upon that, and I've been, I'm a journalist. I've been covering this story my whole life. So I realized what it was, and that is what becomes the opening, the introduction. And in the end, I'm describing how I'm having to speak loudly so that they can hear me, because they prohibited me, the so-called chaperones, which actually are their traffickers. They prohibited me from speaking with the children. And so I was just saying out loud, children deserve the right to speak to journalists. They deserve the right to know that they are loved and cared for, and that we want them here. And I said, I wanted you to hear me. I'm talking to this little girl who I had started a conversation with. I said, I wanted you to hear me because I wanted you to know that I saw you. I see you because once I was you. And that's the thing that I didn't really understand what's going to happen in the process of writing this book. And without revealing too much, it turns out that, with all of my privilege, because we talk about my privilege, your privilege, our privilege, right? I was almost taken from my mother when I arrived in this country.
And that moment, just as a parent, I'm sure you felt it, Dorian, like my heart fell into my feet. That idea of a border agent looking at your mother and saying, the rest of you can go in, but we've got to keep the baby. And I think part of what I want to sort of to draw from, on the one hand, the personal story, but then the big one, it was helpful to remember that family separation has been part of the system that we have used for so much longer than just this one moment.
Let me tell you, that was the thing that, as we say in Mexican Spanish, me aplastó, it left me flat. Because we had known that something had happened. It was like something happened. And then it was like, even when my mom revealed, well, no, at the airport, the agent almost took you. I remember when I first heard that, because there had been some commotion. I was like, well, that's a weird agent. What a weird dude.
Right.
I swear to you, look, and I'm not talking about like I was a little girl I'm talking about as a seasoned adult journalist. I was like, well, why would he want to do? That's so weird. Where was he going to put me? Ha, ha, ha. Laughing it off without realizing. And this is, I don't know if I have the capacity, but I have thought about doing a FOIA and trying to get the architectural plans for the Dallas airport to see where was the room where they would take children and hold them, because I was not the only one. It was a system that was built upon, the original sin was slavery, but the first sin was genocide. So the first taken were indigenous children, and then the children of enslaved Black men and women, and then Japanese American citizen children. So it has been happening throughout.
And Maria, there's two things as I was reading that passage in particular that came to mind. One is the quote from the agent, which was basically, "I'm just doing my job." And then second, though, is actually the story of your mother and resistance.
Yes.
Right. So how do we help us make sense of the long history of those that have enabled these systems because they're just doing their job, and then the of course individual acts and collective acts of resistance?
Whoa, this is the thing that also, when my mother calls me, when she realized, when she was hearing the voices of those babies and toddlers and children, the way we all heard them on the news when ProPublica broke that story, that was when my mother, and by the time she was now in her 80s. And this is when, as we say in Mexican Spanish, le cayó el 20, the coin dropped, and she was like, oh my God. And she said that she spoke back to him in a way, using a tone of voice that she had never used before. And I think about the only other person who I've heard say that was Ana Maria Chuleta, who took on the senator. Remember the elevator moment?
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Ana Maria Chuleta saying in the midst of the hearings for Kavanaugh, saying, that was me. And I remember interviewing her, and she said, I had never used that tone of voice.
Ana Maria from Center for Popular Democracy.
Center for Popular Democracy. So that was what my mother said. She had never used that tone of voice. And so that was her privilege to understand that she could even do that. She was screaming, which is what freaked the agent out. She had, he had a petite 5-foot woman, gorgeous, with 4 children, who was screaming at the top of her lungs. Now, when I think about the question about complicity in systems, this is the part that makes me sick. Because the so-called chaperones, as I say, traffickers of these children, were Latinos and Latina. He was a Latino man and a Latina woman. And the person who was running the largest shelter program throughout all of the Southwest was Southwest Key, a Latino man who I interviewed, getting paid $1.5 million. And he said, look, if I'm not doing this, a white supremacist is going to do this, and he's going to do it horribly. Which I'm like, okay, maybe, but the problem is that the system,
that's right,
the system is set up. And I'm going to warn your listeners and viewers, because it's a little triggering, because if you are a sadist, a rapist, an abuser, a psychopath, a pedophile, you know exactly where to go to find work. In immigrant detention camps, they will employ you. And so those horrors that we're talking about have been going on system-wide, and Latinos and Latinas and Black men and women go stand and see who, well, not anymore, but when I was at Department of Homeland Security at 5:00 p.m., who was coming out? Black men and women.
So I want to, there's one moment in the book where you do precisely this. On page 261, you write, my husband says that the reason it's so hard for me is because I believed in the promise of this country. I bought into exceptionalism. It's hard to accept how ornery and normal and mediocre this country really is. I thought we were better than this, but we aren't. Now detention camps are called La Hilera, the freezer for short, because it's hard to show remnants of torture from freezing.
Yeah.
So much of what you have done professionally has been to tell the stories that nobody else in media even bothered to be curious about, right? It's not just they weren't telling them, they weren't even curious about them. So on a kind of perspective or forward-looking, Maria, as you look at the system of American broadcast and print media, but maybe mostly broadcast, because print's doing okay in terms of its content, what are the things we're not even curious about that we need to be asking questions about?
So in terms of politics, I think the thing that is obsessive to me is the fact that if you look at the numbers, and I know you know this and your viewers know this, that Latinos and Latinas were the second largest potential voting bloc in the United States of America, but you really did get a sense of that at all from any of the coverage. And what I mean is the media places importance on a certain community and makes demands in terms of accountability, like what are the politicians doing to reach this important vote, and the politicians follow. After Obama, we know this, right? After Obama was elected, there was a kind of the collective media was like, "Oh shit, we need to we need to take these black people more seriously here." Like they're okay, and so then there was a demand, right? You were on television, Melissa. So many others, right? That was a moment. That doesn't really happen in terms of the issue of immigration, honestly, because most of the people who run our mainstream news media are overwhelmingly white men of privilege. And they have grown up consuming the media narrative around immigrants that has been part of the mainstream narrative for decades. And that's what I write about in the book. So they too, they're like, oh God, cover immigrants? Oh man, it's like a never ending story. The story never gets better. It's such a problem. You know, we just heard that potentially, you know, what NPR reported was that Joe Biden did not put immigration as one of his top priorities. It was not there. And that NPR reported that the reason why was because there was a sense within the administration kind of like, you know, immigration activists are a little bit too uppity and they're not grateful. And so, you know, maybe not this time. And so
I am literally sipping my tea while you tell this.
I'm just, you're just like, dude, tell me more. So the question is, why wasn't that a bigger story? And the reason why is because we have to make the connection. The murder of George Floyd, which we witnessed. Well, I wouldn't watch, okay? But out of respect. But the murder, that dehumanization, then other part of the extension of that is women's uteruses being removed from their bodies and their children being taken away. Yes. And now when we talk about systems, because it's like, so how, you know, I actually do think we have to be dreamers and say, no, you shut it all down. You can shut it all down. You can shut it all down. But the system problem, you know this, is we're talking about tens of thousands of jobs. I didn't mean to say that all of the employees of the Department of Homeland Security are Black. I didn't mean to say that.
Yeah.
What I meant to say was that we are there. Well, now Alejandro Mayorkas, a Cuban-American immigrant raised in Los Angeles, will be running the Department of Homeland Security. And so what does that mean system-wide when we say we want to do better?
Yeah. Maria Hinojosa, just to say, a lot of us will be putting the president-elect's feet to the fire on immigration, and will force the issue to be a top priority because we have to do something around immigration and the undocumented in this country and the mistreatment. And we could talk to you all night long, but we have to.
Please invite me back.
Yeah.
So I have an invitation, actually. We hope that, first of all, thank you for joining System Check Book Club and being our first guest. But we do hope that you'll join us in the podcast when we do our system check on immigration.
Please.
Because we do want to take up this issue, especially in the beginning of the next year, of the new year.
Please. And remember that what we're really talking about is people's humanity, is centering people's humanity. And we've got to reclaim that because there's been a lot of dehumanizing historically and system-wide in this country that was just intensified over the last 4 years. So we got to bring it back.
Maria Hinojosa, my sister, you are such a gift. Thank you for being with us. And everybody who's watching, stick with us because we are literally just getting started, although our producers are freaking out a little bit about us going long. But we have some extra treats for you this evening. We have a partner in this evening's live event, the New York Public Library. And they've created a brief list of suggested readings connected to each of the authors we're featuring tonight. So you're going to see these book suggestions right here on the screen, and you can check them out later on our Facebook page. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause to reinforce what Maria Hinojosa just raised for us, which is that this issue must be at the top of our agenda for system change. So I want to take a look at a reminder from another one of our partners, Community Change Action. We're going to look at Freedom Together, because Freedom Together is all about citizenship, relief from deportations and enforcement, and inclusive COVID-19 recovery.
It's very hypocritical to say that we think these workers are essential and then at the same time talk about deporting people from this country.
The goal has to be among many that we pass comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway towards citizenship, that we renew immediately the protections of DACA, that we also understand that the DACA recipients have parents who also deserve a path and protection.
Within 100 days, I'm going to send to the United States Congress a pathway to citizenship for over 11 million undocumented people. And all of those so-called dreamers, they're going to be immediately certified again to be able to stay in this country and put on a path to citizenship.
Thank you to Community Change Action for that work. Now, Dorian, who's up next?
Well, Melissa, let's bring in one of our colleagues from The Nation magazine. We are pleased to welcome Kevin Lozano, Associate Literary Editor of The Nation. Kevin's a writer and a critic whose work has appeared in many print and digital venues, and we want to welcome him here. Hey, Kevin, welcome.
Hi, guys.
Hey, it's good to see you outside of an editorial board meeting. So talk to us about 2020, because this has been a hell of a year for all of us, and we've been in various stages of quarantine. So just a very easy, simple question. Are people actually reading more?
I don't know. Do you think people are reading more?
I think they're watching stuff more. I'm reading more.
I'm reading more.
I think people are watching more than they're reading. That's only anecdotal for me. Because I think I'm having a lot of trouble focusing, and maybe that's something other people feel.
It's funny you say that, Kevin, because in some way, so I agree, I am having a lot of trouble focusing, but I suppose this is just like the nerdy reader in me. A book actually helps me to focus better. I like the white noise behind me of music or of radio, certainly of a good podcast, and of TV. But the thing that draws me in is the printed word.
What? Yeah, I guess like I'm only saying I'm having trouble focusing because so much of my job is like picking up the first 50 pages of books to see whether or not there's something we should write about. So I feel like I'm cycling through so much that what I want to focus on after I'm done working is it's less concerned with the printed word sometimes. But I'm with you though. I think you can help me focus as well.
So, Kevin, I will say the minute that it became clear that we were in a pandemic, I, like everybody else in the country, ran out and bought this book. I was just like, I must have it, and I must have it in print in case the world goes dry, and at least I have a book. So for me, like when something is happening, like, again, the nerd, I want to go get a research project on it. I want to make a syllabus about it. But when you think about sort of what you were drawn to beyond sort of the job reading, when you were drawn to, was it to read about what was happening, or was it to escape what was happening?
I think I was reading a lot about what was happening. I felt like I was filling in gaps in my education that I felt like I didn't have. So from the start of the year, I was reading a lot of work by like Cedric Robinson, C.L.R. James, the Copy River Collective. I wanted to like know more about the history of like Black Marxism and feminism. And then there was the sort of the summer protests. So I felt like my reading from the beginning of the year to like what was happening was all intersecting. And I think it like helped me see at least like the politics of the world in a much more clarified way.
So Kevin, and we just to go back to where we started, because this is a new world in which we live, given, when Melissa and I met 21 years ago when we were reading, that's all we did in grad school. But now, like 2020, right, we're in a digital world. It's the velocity and speed of ideas. Just Twitter, for example, right? It's like 24/7 nonstop. There's video everywhere. There are a million podcasts. Do books even still matter to our system of ideas?
I think it depends who you ask. First, I think if you're going to be cynical, I think a lot of books, at least like, with fiction, it seems like they exist in this like matrix of they can become a movie or a TV show, and that can like feel a little depressing. But I think like books will always matter because, especially with the reading I was doing this year, I think I was having my own like mini political awakenings as I was reading all these books, like the Black Jacobins and the Communist Reflective Statement. And in so much as that, like that a book can be a way station to like sort of awakening you to like the world you didn't see before. That's like, it's important.
So one last question from us, and this is really about the nation, which is our home. So, Dorian and I have known each other 21 years. We've known the nation only a little bit less than that. And, I think about sort of what the nation is. I mean, this is in some ways the publication that like is unwilling to even go glossy, right? They're like, no, we're going to print this on like newsprint, right? So in this now digital world, in a world where we have all these great podcasts on the nation, what is the role of a book, though? Not those pithy, smart, 2,000 word or even 700 word articles, but like the book. How does the nation think about how books fit into its system of ideas? Yeah.
So I think like, since books are about the world, they can, tell us about our past and offer insight into the present or the future. In my opinion, the way the nation looks at books and other sort of cultural forms is that they can really situate our place in the world in the moment and, tell us about conflicts that like we didn't see at the time. A novel can tell you a lot about like, class maybe in London or, maybe the way in which a work of journalism can tell you how much like words and rhetoric matter. So I think it's important to look at books as ways to like sort of contextualize everything around you because they are sort of the most important record of like the present, the past, and then the future.
Thank you so much, Kevin Lozano, Associate Literary Editor for The Nation. Thank you for joining us on our first, but hopefully not our last book club, because we love to keep thinking about how the nation situates itself and books within those stories.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
And for our listeners and our viewers, if you want to dig into big ideas, there really is no better way than to get a subscription to The Nation. Each issue is chock full of progressive political analysis and thought-provoking cultural essays. And for our System Check listeners, you can actually get a special deal, 60% off your first year. Just go to thenation.com/System Check subs. That's like subscriptions, like not something else, okay? So nation.com/System Check subs. All right, what are we doing now, Dorian?
Well, I think we're going to see a video of someone. Now, on the very first episode of System Check, Melissa and I spoke with Alicia Garza, co-creator of Black Lives Matter and the principal of the Black Futures Lab, about her compelling new book that Melissa's showing you, The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When Things Fall Apart. Now, be sure to go back to that first episode of System Check and listen to that amazing interview with Alicia. And she couldn't be here with us tonight, but we knew our first book club just had to include her critical, thought-provoking, agitational text. So we asked her to send us a brief video, and we're going to take a look at it right now.
Hi, I'm Alicia Garza, and thank you so much to my friends Dorian Warren and Melissa Harris Perry with System Check for asking me to answer a fundamental question. What does my book have to say about what it might mean to hold the Biden administration accountable? Well, I'm going to give a very quick and simple answer, which is we're going to continue to do the things that we've always done. Protest, put pressure on them through meetings and organizing our people. But I have to be really honest here. If I was to give like my real answer, really what my book talks about is building the kind of power that we need so that any incoming administration is already accountable to our communities, not just in symbol, but in substance. And unfortunately, we are in a moment where the transactions that we've been engaging in a lot of ways have really lacked that fundamental element of having built enough power from the jump to make sure that when we give our votes to any candidate, that they know that they are a vehicle to move our agenda forward, not the other way around. So what my book talks about is how we become those kinds of fighters and how we build that kind of power. And really, it comes from a better and deeper and more rigorous practice of organizing. It comes from making sure that we don't leave anything on the table as it relates to elections. It comes from making sure that our movements reflect the world that we want to live in. And it also comes from making sure that we don't leave anybody behind. So that's how I think we hold this administration accountable. We keep doing what we're doing, but we make sure that we're sharpening our organizing. We make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind or trying to jump the line to try to get what we want in advance of other people getting the things that they need too. And honestly, it looks like making sure that we transform power into the kind that is collaborative, cooperative, and that puts people on notice off jump that you're not getting these votes unless you see yourself as a vehicle to make our lives better. That's that on that. Hi.
That's that on that. I love her. Thank you so much, Alicia Garza. I actually cannot wait to talk to you because later this week, I'm going to be on your podcast, Lady Don't Take No. So first of all, go back to the first episode of System Check and catch us talking with Garza about her book, The Purpose of Power. Then go forward in time and later this week, listen to my conversation with Garza on her podcast, Lady Don't Take No. Also, check out this suggested reading list from the New York Public Library. Remember, they're our partner for this evening, and these are other great books you can read if you think you love Purpose of Power.
Now, if you're just joining us, I'm Dorian Warren. I'm here with Melissa Harris Perry. Together, we host System Check, the latest podcast from The Nation magazine. You can, of course, find System Check on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe today to be the first to hear our episode of the new year, which will be coming out on Friday, January 8th, usually around 5 in the morning, thanks to Frank and Sophie and our team. Tonight, we're hosting...
I'm not up when it comes out.
It's like magic. It just comes out. So tonight, we are hosting our first ever System Check Book Club, and we are checking our system of ideas and the authors who transformed that system this year with their work. So, Melissa, who is up next?
Well, I was over here waiting around the wrong book. I realized I thought I still had Garza's, but I had already moved on because I just have to say, after finishing this book, I genuinely did not sleep for 3 days. It is gripping, suspenseful, searing. And let me explain. The people in this novel are trapped in a house. They're having trouble even getting to the grocery store. They don't have any adequate information about what is happening. They're cut off from all normal human interaction. They're drinking way too much, and every single day ends up feeling like a week. And they're grappling with the dystopia of the domestic. They're revealing deep-seated racism, and they're coping with the death-dealing consequences of environmental and political disaster, which basically sounds like the year I just had. Mm-hmm. The World Behind was a finalist for this year's National Book Award and has already been optioned by Netflix. But like I said, it seems like 2020 already released the live experience version of this novel. Please welcome the award-winning author, Rumaan Alam. It's so nice to have you.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I feel a little outgunned tonight because the other guests on this show are such serious intellectuals, and I'm just a novelist.
No, you're a prophet.
But thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You're not even going to get away with that.
No, don't try it, sir.
The entire time I'm reading it, I was texting him. I can't believe. I was like, I forgot what it was like to read a writer, like not what we do. Like we think thoughts and then we try to communicate some of them so they come out in writing, but a writer, what you do with words in this book is absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you. That's so kind of you. That's so kind of you. And I have to take exception with what your colleague Kevin asserted about his sense that maybe the book is a sort of, it's in a slippery place in this moment. I've read a lot this past since March when the lockdowns began in New York City. And I found it to be such a great comfort. And I hope that the other readers out there will feel the same way. And in a moment when our ability to go to the great civic institutions, like our restaurants, the corner stores, all those things are the way we deal with them is different now. The public library has come back, right? Our great local bookstores are doing what they can to operate safely. And let's face it, like at some point we're going to run out of Netflix television productions because every aspect of business has closed down. And the book is this thing that you can never catch up on. There will always be centuries of text to dig into. And so I find that a great comfort, and I hope other readers have found that a comfort.
Right. There's no matter how much you've read, there's so much you haven't read.
So much more. Yeah.
Will you do me a favor? Because I do love the way you write. Will you take us to the grocery store?
I will. I will indeed. Yeah. So there's a scene. This is a book about a family on vacation, and there's a scene early in the book where the mother, Amanda, goes to the grocery store. I'll just read a little bit from this section. The store was frigid, brightly lit, wide-aisled. She bought yogurt and blueberries. She bought sliced turkey, whole grain bread, that pebbly mud-colored mustard, and mayonnaise. She bought potato chips and tortilla chips and jarred salsa full of cilantro, even though Archie refused to eat cilantro. She bought organic hot dogs and inexpensive buns and the same ketchup everyone bought. She bought cold, hard lemons and seltzer and Tito's vodka and 2 bottles of $9 red wine. She bought dried spaghetti and salted butter and a head of garlic. She bought thick cut bacon and a 2-pound bag of flour and a $12 maple syrup in a faceted glass bottle like a tacky perfume. She bought a pound of ground coffee, so potent she could smell it through the vacuum seal, and size 4 coffee filters made of recycled paper. If you care, she cared. She bought a 3-pack of paper towels and a spray-on sunscreen and aloe because the children had inherited their father's pale skin. She bought those fancy crackers you put out when there were guests, and Ritz crackers, which everyone liked best, and crumbly white cheddar cheese and extra garlicky hummus and an unsliced hard salami and those carrots that are tumbled around until they're the size of a child's fingers. She bought packages of cookies from Pepperidge Farm and 3 pints of Ben & Jerry's politically virtuous ice cream, and a Duncan Hines box mix for a yellow cake, and a Duncan Hines tub of chocolate frosting with a red plastic lid. Because parenthood had taught her that on a vacation's inevitable rainy day, you could while away an hour by baking a boxed cake. I'll stop there. It goes on though, but
I love it.
What you have to understand, readers, listeners, if you haven't read it yet, is every single one of those items shows back up. They're not left there on page 11. That cake and it getting baked is a whole situation, which is what I mean by a writer. I also mean this by a writer. On page 61 and 62, you give us Ruth, and Ruth is a Black woman in her 60s, and she says, Ruth had learned one thing from the current reality, and it was that everything was held together by tacit agreement, that it would. And all it took to unravel something was one party deciding to do just that. There was no real structure to present chaos. There was only a collective faith in order. And given that what we do is systems, I had to stop there and say, oh my God, if that's all there is a collective faith and order, is it like, is it going to be okay?
I mean, I think that because this is a book about people trapped in a house, a lot of my readers have asked about, its relationship to coronavirus and to, quarantine. All of that is pure coincidence.
Dude, you have a bat. The actual conversation about bat disease.
You're more prophetic than you're giving yourself credit for, because it seems so familiar.
It does. It feels familiar because those are the circumstances that we occupy right now. But to Melissa's point, when I was writing the book, it was intended to be a metaphor that talked about our relationship to the climate. And our relationship to the politics of the moment. So I wrote this book in 2018 and 2019, right? So this is the politics of the last 4 years, in which smart people on television talk about norms and decorum, and people with actual power discard those. And so what happens then is that yes, everything was just held together by some sort of faith that it would just hold together, that you would not appoint your son-in-law to be a chief advisor, that you would not grant him a security clearance that he hadn't earned. All of these things, that you wouldn't earn money as while occupying the office of the presidency. All of these norms have simply fallen away because we just decided to give them up. And that's a really chilling realization. You know?
May I ask, because I assume that you know something about your characters relative to how you want us to think about them. Are we supposed to like Amanda? So Amanda's the one who's grocery shopping initially, and she, because in addition to knowing that there was like a bat disease, which I was way down a rabbit hole reading about because of your book at like 3 a.m, but you basically drew the perfect Karen, right? Like,
yeah. Amanda, what happens is that they confront the Black owners of this home, confront the white renters of this home, and then they have to sort of make peace with one another over the course of this unspecified, unknowable emergency. Amanda's response is a pretty profoundly racist one. And then, as Melissa, as you're saying, she's sort of like,
wanted to inspect the mortgage, a photo ID. She
Yeah.
wanted a photo ID. Okay, I'm sorry.
right, that because they're Black, they don't seem to her like they could possess a well-appointed home, right? Yes, she is sort of like the prototypical Karen in that regard. I think like and dislike is sort of like a complicated way to talk about fictional people, right? So I hope that you can dislike her, but also empathize with the ways in which that sort of whiteness is a different kind of victimhood of the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. Simply, like that's all it is. It's the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and it plays out for our Black citizens one way, and it plays out for our white citizens another way. I am not interested in comparing which is worse, because I think we all know which is worse, but Amanda's trap of being able to only understand Blackness as criminal or other is not great either. Like that's a trap. It's a psychic trap.
And one that endangers both her and her family.
Absolutely.
Again, just to go to systems, there's, I'm not going to spoil for those who haven't read, because it's not really clear for a very long time sort of what happened, and maybe it's actually never clear.
That's right.
But I will say that there's a portion around 120, 121 where you do write what is maybe the clearest idea of about what happened, and it is all about these interlocking systems, right? The environment, the electrical grid, public transportation, international tensions, literally levees, right? Air traffic control, oil pipelines. Again, part of it is like, are we going to be okay, given that you knew this 2 years ago? But I think more than that, how do we deploy literature, art, music, all of the things that we tend to think of as like a personal narrative to help us to reveal those systems?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew, because that's been the work of art from its very beginning, right? And so there's so much art that predates my feeble attempt at it, that shows us that we must understand the humanity of those people who are incarcerated, or those people who are dealing with homelessness, or those people who are ill. I think that the fundamental broken system that underlies all of these is education. If we had a system of education that taught our citizens to think critically and read critically, and to care about doing that, to see the value in engaging with art and what it might teach you, then everything would be different. In some ways, I have to believe we don't have that system by design, you know? And I don't think either of you would disagree with that.
Yeah.
It's simply what we can do, but art has a great power, and I think it's important not to forget that. I think it's really important not to forget that, and to cherish the art that actually does change people's minds and does touch people, even if it's just to provide them solace in this moment where we're all stuck at home and feeling isolated from one another, you know?
So Rumaan, we're out of time, but I have to ask you one more question, because it broke my soul. It broke Melissa's soul. I have a 9-week-old baby, and we're going to hear her, I'm sure, at some point, because she's fussy and sassy and has a lot to say, apparently. But one of the core themes in the text is about loving parents who do have resources. who are unable to protect their children in the
Yeah.
context of a mass disaster. And so thank you for giving me lots of sleepless nights.
I'm sorry, Tori. I mean, congratulations on the baby, though.
But can you just quickly talk to us about, or how do we think about a system analysis of children in caring for kids?
I think it's one of the powers, it's one of the responsibilities that society has abdicated wholly, especially to care for the children of the people who are propping up what is left of the economy right in this moment, right? They're wholly uncared for. But I think it's so important because it is this sort of fundamental defining human characteristic, right? A mother who comes here from Honduras seeking political asylum loves her daughter in exactly the same way that you love your daughter. There's actually no difference. And the better we are able to understand that, the better, that gives me some faith about our ability to do something about it. But the truth is that the power, I think, for change that lies ahead is already in the hands of the generation that your daughter belongs to, right? Like they will have to take up the mantle of dealing with what we've done to the planet because they will be around and we will not.
Is Rose okay? Does she turn? Is it okay?
Rose, I think, holds in her my faith in your daughter's generation, in my son's generation, in what lies ahead, because I do think there are very smart young people whose names we don't know, who care deeply about what is going to happen. And I often say that rather than being over 35 to be the president, you should have to be like over 24, because I do think that we need real political power in the hands of younger people.
And last thing, and then Dorian, you can transition this, but I just have to say one last thing. Thank you for writing a 60-year-old Black woman so perfectly.
Oh, well, thank you for feeling that I did it well.
Because when Ruth was like, you saw how dirty they had the kitchen? I just got my whole life together. And thank you for that.
Rumaan Alam, thank you for writing this amazing book. And thank you for joining the System Check Book Club, our first annual. So we hope we'll have you back sometime soon.
I'd love to. Such a great pleasure. Thank you.
So if you're intrigued by Leave the World Behind, check out this suggested reading list from our partner, the New York Public Library. And of course, this conversation has us thinking of just how truly extraordinary it is that in a time of death, in a time of loss, in a time of isolation, in a time of fear, of racial violence, we actually still managed to do something pretty remarkable as a country and as a nation. In November, more people voted than in any previous American election. And getting people to the polls wasn't an accident. It wasn't coincidence. It didn't just happen by itself. It was an outcome of sustained organizing and mobilization. And so we're going to celebrate that accomplishment with a reminder from our partner, the Community Change Action, about the power of human relationships to create change in systems. Let's take a look.
We thought this year was going to be lit. We dreamed big, made plans, and prepared for our future. But we've been tested this year. We marched in the streets for Black lives. We showed up for each other, sharing food, giving out masks, pulling through by pulling together. The super rich have made bank in this pandemic off our lives. Who are they to tell us we can't achieve our dreams? We refuse to let what we look like or where we come from divide us. This summer, we got our country to march in defense of Black lives. This fall, we vote to deliver Black dreams.
Such a powerful reminder. Thank you to Community Change Action. Now, we're going to move on to our next guest, who I met back in 2012. Now, I had just started hosting MHP Show, and he joined what was called Nerdland as a guest to talk about his book, Almost President, right? It was a book about the men who lost the race but changed the nation. It was kind of a fascinating exploration of how presidential losers have nonetheless helped to shape the American project. And I got to say, I have revisited that book very often over the course of the past 4 years. But today, we're going to talk about the powerful and brutal and insightful new book by New York Times bestselling author Scott Farris. The book is called Freedom on Trial, the first post-Civil War battle over civil rights and voter suppression. And it tells a story I didn't know, the story of the federal government prosecution of the South Carolina KKK in the early 1870s. And I thought I knew something about Reconstruction, but I learned so much. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Melissa. It's wonderful to see you and Dorian. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
So I want to dig a little bit into some of the nerdy here, right? So, so you write about the Great South Carolina KKK trials, not the Great South Carolina KKK, right? But the trials being about more than just the guilt or innocence of those individual Ku Klux who were charged with the crimes, but rather that it was really about these two big issues. Was the 14th, is it the fact that the 14th and the 15th Amendment made it so the Bill of Rights were now rights guaranteed to individuals, regardless of where they lived? And secondly, whether or not the federal government was constitutionally bound to protect those rights if the states wouldn't. And again, I think for so many of us living in the 21st century, the idea that those were open questions and that that's really the beginning to answer them was such a powerful framework.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was one of the revelations to me as I was doing the research to learn that before the 14th Amendment was approved, it was just generally assumed the Bill of Rights didn't apply to individuals. They were simply restrictions on the power of the federal government, and the states had every right to infringe on your what we would now consider our civil rights. And in fact, in the South, there was no First Amendment right to free speech. You couldn't criticize slavery without going to jail. So yeah, it's an enormous surprise to me to learn that even though we've had the Bill of Rights since Madison and Jefferson, they didn't apply to people until starting in the 1870s.
And I think for me also, so there's a couple systems I want to go through that one of the systems, right, when you talk about the Bill of Rights not applying, is also just that idea of national citizenship. I can imagine that most folks believe the idea of being an American citizen begins right around 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. But in fact, it's actually almost 100 years later that we only become national citizens, right, in the context of this 14th Amendment after a bloody civil war and as a way of identifying a whole new era of governance. Why does that matter?
Well, it matters because obviously we want equality before the law. And if every state can treat its citizens differently, there is no national equality. And so it is remarkable that the Constitution doesn't define who is a citizen of the United States, certainly didn't at the beginning. And so this was a real struggle. And the Civil War obviously changed how we perceive our country. The old cliche is before the war, people said the United States are, and after the war, they said the United States is. And so we went from the plural to the singular. And so it was a really a remarkable change. And so as the second founding fathers, which some of the congressmen and senators after the Civil War thought of themselves as, is okay, we've gone through this tremendous struggle. Let's talk about how it has changed our conception of being American, what those rights mean. Now we're also bringing in these whole group of people who had previously been enslaved. Now they're going to be citizens. What does that mean? What are their protections? What are their rights? What can they do? And so it was a second American, it was not just a Civil War, it was a second American Revolution. And so the purpose of these trials to a large degree, as you mentioned, Melissa, was not only to adjudicate the guilt or innocence and provide some measure of justice to these poor folks who'd been brutalized by the Ku Klux Klan. It was also specifically, they were looking for cases that they could give to the Supreme Court, another system we can talk about, to say, please give us a broad interpretation of what this means now. We want a broad interpretation of what it means to have civil rights and the federal government's obligation to enforce those. And the Supreme Court let us down.
So Scott, if I can jump in here, because we're going to actually talk to John Nichols soon about another effort in the 40s that was failed around an economic bill of rights that FDR and particularly his vice president Wallace was pushing. But I want to come to the system of public goods, because what a lot of people don't understand about Reconstruction and the Reconstruction era is that was really the genesis of public goods in the South. There were no public schools to segregate before the 14th Amendment. Right. And people, I often want to remind folks that, hey, for poor white folks in the South too, but for Reconstruction, no public schools that later, of course, there were to segregate. So talk to us about why, let me just read a passage from the book from page 109. Sure. You write that Wright and his cohorts were unapologetically trying to make South Carolina more like New England and the Midwest. The radicals established the first public school system in South Carolina, increased funding for the state hospital and asylum, and devoted funds toward what were called internal improvements, such as roads, canals, and railroads to spur development of commerce. So infrastructure, right? This is the opposite of austerity politics. This is investment in public goods. So help us understand the creation of this system of public goods, but then why conservatives recede from support of particularly the public education system after Brown in 1954?
Sure. Yeah, it is. Again, the South was just really almost a completely separate country in terms of its approach to all sorts of things. And as you mentioned, public services being one of them. If the only education provided before the war was when planters would hire private tutors, and if they were gracious, they might invite the neighbor kids to come in. And of course, for African-American children, there was no education at all. And so after the war, the radical Reconstruction governments, it's funny we call them radical because they advocated equality and what we think is basic rights, but they're the radical Republicans in those days. And so they said, yes, obviously the South can benefit from public education and a whole host of things. The Freedmen's Bureau was really the first welfare program in the history of the United States. And actually, in many places, the Freedmen's Bureau served poor whites more than they served poor blacks at the time. And so it was something that everyone got used to. And one of the interesting things when you look at, for example, in the congressional testimony, where these former Confederates are coming and complaining about the radicals, they always get back to the issue of taxes, how upset they are that they're now paying taxes to support public schools and some of these other things that we would just take for granted as a basic public service. But it caused a great reaction in the South. They'd never paid such taxes. Why should they pay them now? What's the point of public education?
Now, for all of the work that this is about voting and about, as you write, testifying in court and serving on juries, I do not want to miss one more really important system issue about which you write, which is you said that all of this was necessary to ensure that African Americans could exercise their full rights of citizenship. But the most important of all the Bill of Rights, as far as freedmen and women were concerned, was the Second Amendment right to own firearms. And given the brutality and the horror that you write about in this book, so I just want to kind of tell folks, it's history and law, but it's also very embodied. Talk to us about what that Second Amendment meant in the 1870s for newly freed Black men and women.
That was another sort of internal revelation for me, and I'm assuming, like you too, I've long advocated for gun control, and we just have way too many guns in this society. But then you forget, sometimes you do need personal defense, and so in the 1870s, 1868, as the Ku Klux Klan sort of evolved from this sort of benign social club to this paramilitary force, almost a second insurrection against the government. In order for Black people to exercise their rights, they first needed to be safe. And so they armed themselves as anybody would. Plus, they were hunted. Obviously, that's a food source, too. And one of the first things when the Ku Klux Klan would do their raids, they had two basic objectives. One was obviously to ensure that Black people didn't vote, or if they did vote, they voted the way they were told to vote. And the other was to take their guns away, because then that would make them more vulnerable to additional voter suppression and additional pressures. So it was a remarkable thing. And in fact, the prosecutors in the trials who were led by Amos T. Ackerman, a former Confederate who actually became one of the strongest advocates for Black civil rights in the history of the Attorney General of the United States, said, find some cases that we can sort of help protect the newly freed under the Second Amendment, that if the Ku Klux Klan are taking their guns, they're violating the Second Amendment to the Constitution, and then Black people will have some ways for redress. And so I never thought about the Second Amendment that way. It's sort of a crucial right to protect your individual freedoms. That's something we associate with right-wingers and militiamen of the current period, but it was absolutely vital to Black Americans. And so what took their place was state-sponsored militias that African Americans joined en masse to protect the community and protect their rights. And as I said, protect everybody's rights. These weren't not just rights that were going to had received by African Americans. They were for all Americans. And I'm sorry, you didn't mention it yet, but part of the book is my own great-grandfather's role in the Ku Klux Klan. And he wasn't smart enough to understand those were his rights too, and instead he was working against his own interests.
So Scott, I want to come to this. This is our last question. And I just have to say, I'm a Reconstruction nerd, but what is really important about your book that runs the theme is that to understand the Klan, it's not in that domestic terrorism against Black people. It's not just because of individual bias or racism. It was always connected to political power and the vote. Yeah. And that it is such an important theme that you keep hitting at throughout the book. But this book is also really personal, as you just said.
Yeah.
Because your great-grandfather was in the South Carolina Klan. Your great-grandfather committed acts of violence against Black people. And so what did it mean to you to have to grapple with as a historian, but also as someone descended, right, from this person. How did you grapple with this personal and national history at the same time?
Well, one of my hopes for the book is it will inspire others to look more realistically at their family history. I mean, when we find somebody who came off the Mayflower or signed the Declaration of Independence, we can't wait to put their portrait over the mantelpiece. I'm descended from this wonderful stock of Americanism. But what about those of us who are also descended from people who did horrible things and part of American history too? And so it was sobering. Again, you realize this person, I have 1/8 of my DNA basically comes from this person. And I say, I don't believe in inherited guilt, but I do believe that we are bequeathed certain obligations by our ancestors. And I think one of the obligations is to tell the truth about the past and try to make amends for the crimes they committed. And so, as I point in the book, it would be very incongruous of me to write a book to atone for my family history and then to try to make money off that. So whatever royalties I receive, I would like people to know I'm going to donate to social justice organizations. Melissa's been offering a couple of ideas on that. And so it is something where you just want to realize that in time and place, we're all capable of doing terrible things. And so we have this ongoing obligation. No system is just finished. It always requires constant maintenance and attention if it's going to work properly and with justice for all. So I think what it done for me, it reminded me that I have an attachment to this issue, and I therefore have an obligation to keep working on it and to continue to make the system more perfect, because it's always going to be a work. Every generation is going to face the same challenges, and it requires constant attention.
Scott Farris, thank you for continuing to illuminate American history in so many crucial ways. Thank you for writing that you're going to ensure your great-grandfather's soul is at rest, in part by ensuring that the resources from this text are going to organizations that support racial justice and voter participation and a more honest interpretation of the Reconstruction era. And thank you for joining the System Check Book Club.
It was a great pleasure, great honor. I'm so glad it's going so well, and best to both of you. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Happy holidays. So Melissa, I learned so much from this book, and I realized that as a nation, we have this continuing need really to engage the study of history, because most of us have either big gaps or deep misunderstandings of our own history. We don't know the history of our systems. And even if we think we know, sometimes we actually don't know. And I think, I've said this, I'm a Reconstruction history addict. And I always go back to the classic W.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, the masterful Black Reconstruction from 1935, which if you read it today, you'll be like, oh, this seems really familiar. So if you want to learn more about the era of Reconstruction, check out these suggested readings from our partner, the New York Public Library.
And this point that you're making, Dorian, about what we think we know about our history but don't always know is actually a perfect segue to our next book. Now, a few years ago, I talked with Jeanne Theoharis about this book. This is the grown-up version of the book. And it was mind-blowing because it turns out everything we think we know about Rosa Parks is wrong. Not just incomplete, it's actually inaccurate. And the real story of Rosa Parks is much more harrowing, much more heartbreaking, and in fact, much more heroic than the kind of sanitized tale of a tired seamstress sitting on a bus. So in 2014, Jeanne Theoharis, the distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College, set out to rewrite our understanding of Rosa Parks with this extraordinary text, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. But now, Theoharis has adapted her award-winning biography of Rosa Parks for young adult readers. And teen readers are going to identify with the compassionate and complex Parks that they find in Theoharis's Young Readers edition of this book. The book is slated for publication in early 2021. And so we asked Professor Theoharis to send us a brief video for tonight's book club. Take a look.
Rosa Parks is one of the most celebrated Americans today, taught in schools across the country. And yet much of what we learn about her is incomplete, distorted, and at times just plain wrong. She wasn't tired or old or meek or quiet, or middle class. She had a life history of being rebellious, as she put it, that began as a young person. She spent 2 decades fighting white supremacy before she made her historic bus stand. And she continued for 40 more years after the Parks family was forced to leave Montgomery, still facing death threats and unable to find work, and they settled in Detroit. So Rosa Parks actually spent more of her life fighting the racism of the North. And she didn't just fight against bus segregation, but school inequality, housing segregation, job discrimination, the war in Vietnam, South African apartheid, the injustices of the criminal justice system, and police brutality. And throughout her life, she held out her greatest hope for the spirit and energy and militancy of young people, delighting as Black Power took off in Detroit and across the country. Her hero was Malcolm X. Young people need this truer, fuller history of Rosa Parks. Indeed, Americans need this truer, fuller history of Rosa Parks, not just to understand her better, not just to understand the civil rights movement better, but to understand where we are in this country today and where we must go from here.
Whew, thank you, Professor Theoharis. And just for you system checkers, there is someone related to her that makes an appearance in one of our podcasts. So check it out. If you want to,
I feel like we should give like a prize. Like if you could find who's related to Jeanne Theoharis and send us what episode that was in.
Exactly.
A system check mug.
Some swag. Yeah. First person on Twitter who can find it, you get some swag. All right. So if you want to learn more about the untold history of Black women in particular in the freedom struggle in this country, check out these suggestions from our partner, the New York Public Library. And remember, if you care about the understanding of all of our history, of a full history, and if you care about imagining new possibilities for the future, then you should also be a subscriber to The Nation. Now, The Nation magazine has been fighting for progressive change since 1865. You heard me right, 1865, the year, right, when we embarked on our very first effort to reconstruct our democracy and our economy. And The Nation is not about to stop now under a Biden presidency. So System Check listeners can get a special subscription deal, 60% off your first year by going to thenation.com/systemchecksubs. Support The Nation, support this show, and subscribe today.
All right. If you are just joining us, if you maybe had some dinner, now you're scrolling through, I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and I'm here with Dorian Warren. And together we host System Check. System Check is the latest podcast from The Nation. And this right now is our very first System Check book club. I heard Dorian said first annual, but I'm thinking we might have to do these like monthly. So we'll see. Now, we are checking in on the system of ideas and the authors who transformed that system with their work this year. And we're also giving you a preview of some terrific new titles that are coming your way in 2021. Including the next book, which I have to tell you, I've literally been waiting on for years because I have wanted a parenting book from Janice Johnson Diaz since the moment I met her daughter, the then 12-year-old superhuman named Marley Diaz. Now, Marley is the founder of the 1000 Black Girl Books. She's now, I can't even stand it, 16 years old. She hosts the new Netflix series Bookmarks. And as the mom of 2 Black daughters, I actually wanted to know what kind of parenting contributed to making such a funny, smart, kind, self-possessed, injustice-slaying girl like Marley. The answer has finally arrived with Janice Johnson Diaz's forthcoming book, Parent Like It Matters, How to Raise Joyful Change-Making Girls. So welcome, Janice. Thank you. I've actually now you're my actual friend now. I tried to be friends with your daughter, and she was like, ma'am, you're old. So I was like, can I be friends with your mom?
Well, I am delighted to be your friend after having watched you for so many years. And I was like, she's like a real person. So it is, the pleasure is really all mine in every way.
So let's just jump in here. So I want you to do systems and this text. So what are the systems that make it challenging to raise a Black girl and to be a Black girl?
I mean, America makes it really hard to be a Black girl and to be a joyous, free, liberated Black girl. And therefore, parents have to do a significant amount of work. The first thing that parents have to do is to figure out how to be joyous, liberated parents. Because the desire to just raise our children to be those things when we're not those things is silly, I would say, and unproductive. But the first kind of core systems that our children interact with outside of us is indeed the educational system, and certainly our neighborhood and how our neighborhoods are organized. And so I really urge caregivers to get themselves informed about how the educational system operates in practice, not the theoretical notions of like, we were once segregated and now we're integrated, but like, how is it working in your children's school? And then to have a better understanding of what's happening in their neighborhoods, and how neighborhood and the politics of class and race and gender come together to organize their children's lives and to create a significant amount of disarray and chaos.
But let me tell you, this is, I feel like, is this Professor Janice? Because you are being so modest in this moment. And you're not actually modest. So let's just go ahead, shake it off.
The thing is, my task here, this is my first public event about and so I want folks to really kind of get this thing, right? Yes. Like they have to get this thing. The first thing is you can't raise no joyful change-making girl if you ain't joyful and change-making. Like,
okay, pause right there. Pause right there because I want to dig into that for a second because it is part of what is so distinctive about this book. Because I just really want people to get this. You know, you hear, oh, it's a parenting book. And most parenting books, like the author kind of stands up like, I am the great expert. And here are the things that you can do. ABC, play the Mozart, read the Bob books, whatever. But instead, this book is also a memoir. And whoa, you're doing a lot of internal work. You're managing that whole immigrant identity situation. You're going back around class. So, and that I think is maybe part of the hardest part of what you call us to is to do that work in order to be.
Yeah, it's really critically important to me. I mean, and I say this both in ridiculousness and in seriousness, is that if you want a different world, if you want a world that is just, you as a caregiver are going to have to make that world. You are going to have to do your part, not the do as I say, not the, oh, baby, you can do better than me when you grow up. You are going to have to do the work. And so I wanted a liberated child, a child who was healed. And that meant that all of the baggage, and I do mean rocks and bag on crocus bag on everything, I was going to have to figure out what I was going to do with my garbage. And in the book, I say you need to know your ACEs, your adverse childhood experiences. You got to get real familiar with them. You got to get involved in it. And you have got to figure out how to unburden some of those things. My grandmother used to say, the best thing about the past is that it done. And so a part of what we know.
Can you say that again? Can you say that again, please?
The best thing about the past is that it done. So we can't live back there, right? And we have an aspiration for the future, but we've got to deal with now. The past informs us, and we have got to decide what from the past is useful for us to carry forward. If it's not useful to you, drop it, right? And then decide how you're going to do. So my particular life and the life that has helped to shape my daughter is a life that's not fictional or theoretical. I've had hard, bad things happen. I have contributed to some of the hard, bad things, but a lot of them happen without my contribution. And so what do I do with it? I can decide all kinds of ways once I'm old enough what I'm going to do with it. What I decided to do with it was to pick it apart, to take the parts that work and the ones that work, that really enrich me, that creates joy for me, I'm carrying it all the way. The ones that don't serve me, they got to go. And they had to go with the help of therapy, friends, maybe some Jack and Coke, maybe but they have to go.
Okay, but all right, and one more twist though, because I don't want, on the one hand, I don't want them to think it's a parenting book. I'm sitting up here telling you what to do. I also don't want them to think that it's a purely atomized, individualistic, like if you work your own stuff out, you can be a good parent. Because the book is actually about also being a freaking community organizer.
Exactly.
So when I first thought about parenting, like I wasn't one of those hype people. It's fine if my ovaries just chill, right? And so I come to parenting willfully. I did decide to become a parent. It wasn't an accident. I planned to have this child, but I wasn't enthusiastic hand raised about children. But what I quickly realized, once you have a child, that this means that you're going to have to invest in some systems. And one of the core systems is your community. Like you can't be out here thinking that, the old messages of yesterday, which is just mind your own business, that will not work for creating a just world. You will have to raise a child who is connected, who understands system, who understands how systems work very early on, that you understand systems, that you build a child who values community and can use community, especially in those hard personal moments, but particularly in those deeply unjust moments. So a child is a conduit in many respects, and also an opportunity to be a better community organizer. And I think for many of us, we want the world to change. And what I argue is the locus of control is the greatest in our homes, but what we do in our homes is directly related to what happens in the society.
Janice, can I ask you a question on this? Because I'm a new parent as of 9 weeks ago, and of a girl. And so your book really, thank you for the instruction manual, so to speak. but I actually want to pick up on what you just said. And I'm also a professional community organizer, so that also really resonates with me. And I'm just wondering, can you help us think through, are there special burdens for Black parents in terms of the necessity of taking the village approach to raising children, or the community organizing role of parenting? Can you talk to us about what that means to be a Black parent in America?
So I'm not confident that I would use the word burden. There is a special understanding of being a Black parent. One, we have a 13% problem, right? So we know we are few, and we are only multiplied in the minds of the racists, right? And so, but our actual numbers are quite few. And so as a Black parent, I think one of our charges and responsibility is to not deny race, and to not raise our children, particularly middle-class parents, as colorblind. You must not do this. And there's an effort to think that conversations about race, knowledge of US racial history and world anti-Blackness history is going to be burdensome. And what I argue in the book, and I show with data, is that knowledge is actually quite liberating. And I urge Black caregivers to really get into a place of becoming better informed. I think that is a part of our responsibility that white parents really need to also be better informed. But for us, we need nuanced understanding of micro interactions, of how the systems are playing out in our daily lives. We really need to get that when the teacher says, oh, you just keep raising your hand all the time. And the child comes home and she says to you, the teacher tells me I'm raising my hand all the time, that it's just like, you don't ask the child, well, do you raise your hand all the time? Oh, but no. Oh, but no, right? That instead you're asking your child a different set of questions. You're asking your child to get a better understanding of what are the systems at play in the classroom, such that your child wanting to learn becomes a problem, because you are going to have to equip that child with how to respond to that teacher or any set of people who says that your visibility should be made invisible. So I do think that there is a special understanding that Black caregivers have to do. And I urge Black parents in particular to release a couple of things that seem to be working fine for whites, but will not work for us, which is a commitment to sexism. That's not going to work out for us. We're going to have to get really right on our gender politics. And we are going to have to really think about intersections from the beginning. Our boys and our girls are, white folks can do some stuff that we should not be in the business of doing. They shouldn't do it either, but we should.
I feel it starting to come. The real Professor Janice. I'm gonna draw her back just so that we can keep selling all these books to all the people. But here's what I'm gonna say: if talking to you doesn't always make me feel 100 feet tall, I am so grateful. And I don't know. I think you know that your book is on a pretty amazing list by Working Mother magazine. It is one of the books that was identified by Working Mother magazine as a book that all moms, even them white ones, all the mamas need to buy it and read it. If you have a Black girl in your life, what you need to do is make sure that you are reading this book, that you are thinking about it. When Dr. Janice Johnson-Diaz says that she thinks people should know about systems, you need to understand she hosted an 8-week online Zoom class about how American politics works. And it was free for the folks who were engaged in it. It was amazing. The Anna Julia Cooper Center team is still so grateful for you letting us be part of that. When we are done seeing this list of books, we're going to see a few more books, some suggestions from our partners at the New York Public Library. And I just want to say again, Janice, I love you. Thank you.
I am so grateful. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm loving these books that are the suggested books.
Yes.
And I am hoping this book is particularly useful for those of us who are working in middle-class families, regardless of race, because we can, in fact, really raise joyful change-making girls and make a difference in the world. So I'm excited that this is my first public conversation about it, and how important this moment is for me. So thank you.
Professor Janice Johnson-Diaz, thank you for making this your first public conversation about your book. And we want to talk to you in March when your book is on the shelf. So I hope you'll join us on System Check.
I hope to see you all, and I'll drag a little guest along with me.
So, Melissa, I can't wait to give this book out, actually, as gifts, of course, right? Because we got a preview, but I just can't wait. And you, of course, should look at the suggestions for other books like this from the New York Public Library. I also need to say a very special thank you to another partner for tonight's event, Denver's independent bookstore, The Tattered Cover, which recently became the country's largest Black-led bookstore. So thank you, Tattered Cover, and good luck.
Yes, congratulations. All of that. Books for us, by us. Love it.
Independent bookstores. Yes. Our next guest I'm very excited about because he's our colleague from The Nation. John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent at The Nation magazine. He's also a contributing writer for The Progressive and In These Times. He's associate editor of Capital Times, the daily newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin. And for those of you that don't know, you should know, no one knows Wisconsin politics better than the great John Nichols. Now, his latest book is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, where he reveals the legacy of former Vice President Henry Wallace, who warned of the persisting danger of American fascism and urged the Democratic Party, all this sounds familiar, that he urged the Democratic Party to reject imperialism in favor of a genuinely progressive future. And it's a message that John says the Democratic Party needs to heed now. So welcome to the System Check Book Club, John. Oh, and I think you're muted, sir. We'll pretend like it's a Zoom call. There we go. I think, what? There we go. Okay, we got you.
Well, you missed me saying how honored I am to be with both of you and how much I love the podcast. I love what you're doing.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to jump in here. New Dealer, Agriculture Secretary, Commerce Secretary, third party presidential candidate in 1948 in the Progressive Party platform, founder of what later became the Wallace Global Fund. But Henry Wallace was the second vice president to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And FDR is such a huge, towering figure, right? Historically, we rarely think of vice presidents as critical. So what did we miss, John, by ignoring Wallace?
Just about everything. As is often the case. Henry Wallace was all that you say. It's important to understand he came into the White House with Franklin Roosevelt in March of 1933, and he was there to the day that Roosevelt died. He was the true keeper of the New Deal promise. And it wasn't that he thought the New Deal was perfect. It's important, as people who deal with history, to understand the New Deal was fundamentally flawed in many, many ways. It was too cautious in many ways. And yet, this notion that the biggest problems that America faced could be dealt with, that government itself could do good, that we could do dramatic things, that underpinned the New Deal. And Henry Wallace took that in, preached that gospel, and fought for it when others, including many people that we think of today as great Democrats, let it down. And at the heart of the thing, at the very heart of the thing, he said during World War II, as our World War II vice president, he said that, yes, we needed to fight fascism in Europe, but then we needed to come home and fight fascism in America. And he identified American fascism as racism.
So I want to go to the vision and then ask you a question about why this was a key decision point that affected the rest of the century of our politics. But I want you to first talk to us about Wallace's vision, because in 1942, he gives a speech about how the 20th century should be the century of the common man. He was also an advocate for FDR's second Bill of Rights, the Economic Bill of Rights. And what was the vision? And I know it was a strong anti-racist vision as well. Take a few seconds to tell us, what was his actual vision?
Well, Henry Wallace had an evolving vision. He was a liberal Republican as a young man. He was really a farm advocate. He was from rural America. But when he came into the Roosevelt administration, he realized the possibilities of government. And so his vision was to create a government that strove for economic and social and racial justice, for preservation of the planet, and for peace. Now, he was not a pacifist. He understood the necessity of World War II, but he believed that if you addressed fundamental challenges of inequality at home and abroad, that you could avoid the wars of the future. And this is really a heart and soul thing, because I think Democrats still forget this. I think a lot of political people forget this. They think, well, we can focus on the domestic challenges and that'll be okay. We'll do that. But what they lose sight of is what we saw with Lyndon Johnson, a president who was doing a lot of good domestically, and then got all wrapped up in Vietnam. And Dr. King had to tell him how bad it was, and he didn't listen. And so we ended up losing the promise of the Great Society. What Wallace taught was that if you focused on anti-racism at home, anti-sexism, if you thought to reduce the economic inequality, and also if you went abroad with that same focus, you could actually build a US policy and frankly a global policy that dialed down the prospect of wars and dialed up the prospect of justice.
So, John, Dorian, when I heard you, when we were talking with Scott Farris, and you sort of combined, and you're like, we're about to talk to John Nichols. So I was like, I was thinking the same thing, right? In certain ways, is counterfactual, right? The path that we didn't take. And so, for Scott, in one of the books, it's about the people who don't win, right? The presidency. But in this case, it's like, what if we listen to the vice president? Like, what would it look like? Who might would we have been? And yes, I did sort of maybe do like a thing there about Kamala, but what if what if the vice presidency was something that was not just waiting for the top, for the principal to die? So what did we not do? What's the counterfactual? What might our present look like if we had taken Wallace's path?
Well, let me sum it up by a speech that Wallace gave after he was vice president. In 1947, he went to speak to a group of fraternities, Black fraternities, out in Oklahoma City, and he said, "Look, let's be frank with ourselves. Let's be frank about the reality of what happens in this country. A Black child born today in the same city as a white child, Black male child born in the same city as a white male child, will live, according to science, according to the numbers we know, 10 years less." He says, we must fight for those 10 years. And Wallace understood this. Now, what didn't make him perfect, I'm not trying to make him into the perfect hero, but what I'm telling you is to have a president who understood that fundamental reality in the 1940s.
47.
Coming out of World War II, if he had, they kicked him off the ticket in 1944 because of his focus, frankly, on race, on class, on gender. He was knocked off that ticket. Now, if he had stayed on that ticket, he would have become president of the United States. And in 1945, you would have had a president of the United States who said, no, we've got to deal with these issues now, not 20 years from now. So just think of how much. Now, it would have been hard. Nobody tells you it would have been easy, but think of how much could have been addressed. Then think about having a president who was 100% committed to the Equal Rights Amendment, who appeared with women's groups and fought for that. And think about having a president who, coming out of World War II, said, look, is there a possibility that we can avoid a Cold War? Is there a possibility that we can come home to America and focus on meeting human needs here, implementing an economic Bill of Rights? And one final thing, had he been president and been able to implement that economic Bill of Rights or some elements of it in 45 and 46, the Democrats might have held the Congress, and you might not have gotten the Taft-Hartley Act and other laws that began to dismantle not just the New Deal, but frankly began to dismantle our people power. So would a lot be different? That's why I wrote the book.
So John, the reason why I love this book, so I'm just going to hold up this book I'm going to read over the holidays. You see how thick it is? Our good friend Rick Perlstein, who's a Nation contributor on Reaganland and America's Right Turn. And I raise it as an example. You know, there's just a literature of a whole bunch of books now on how trying to explain our current crisis. Like, how do we get to Trump and Trumpism? So some people start in the 80s, some people start in the 70s. I love that you take us to the 40s and to this decisive moment, but I want to bring it forward now. Okay, so who's inherited the legacy of Wallace for the Democratic Party? Is it Sanders? Is it Warren? Is it the squad and the growing squad? Because at the end of the book, you name some of those folks. So who are who, not to give it away, but
I'll give it away. I'm delighted. And Melissa, I happen to think it's a good tale.
Melissa wants to know if the Democratic Party has a soul to fight for.
That's my question, because I'm not sure.
Well, let's divide the two up. And let's do first who I think is fighting for it, and then maybe we get to that final element. And so at the close of the book is a history. First half is about Wallace. The second half is about this battle for the soul, because Wallace battled for the soul of the party and frankly lost. And a lot of other people along the way lost. That's important to understand, but they didn't all lose. There were people who battled their way in, and I write about Shirley Chisholm and George McGovern and Jesse Jackson and so many other people that battled. But at the close of the book, the last chapter, I did it with two people. I went to Henry Wallace's birthplace with Bernie Sanders. We walked the same fields and talked about that economic Bill of Rights. But the book closes with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We were in Detroit, just a few blocks away from where Wallace gave what I think was his greatest speech, the speech in 1943 that led to an integrated audience in Detroit after a race riot where police killed 17 African-American men. Wallace said, if you accept this racism, then you are no different from the Nazis we're fighting against, right? And that was this incredible his speech on American fascism. So we were just a few blocks away from there. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I talked about the New Deal and about Roosevelt and understanding all the nuances, all the complexities. She talked about this big vision, the bold vision, the trying to solve real problems now, and said, I want to be that party again. And so in answer to Melissa's question, is there a soul to fight for?
In 30 seconds or less, too.
Yeah, easy. Those who choose to fight for it must fight for it in that spirit. They must understand they are not merely fighting a tactical or structural battle of the moment. They are fighting an 80-year-long battle for economic and social and racial justice and for dealing immediately with the challenges that have been too long deferred.
Well said.
Well said, John Nichols. And maybe you can convince me.
Yeah. Well, I'm not telling you the only thing I got it. Is
John Nichols,
somebody wants to fight hard.
National Affairs correspondent for The Nation and an always perpetual hard fighting writer, activist, and thinker. Thank you for joining System Check Book Club today.
Thank you.
And
so honored to be with you both.
Yay, we're so happy to have you.
Thank you, sir.
Someday when we're all together again, we'll all be together again. For everybody who's still with us and watching and listening or who just joined us, remember that one of our big partners for tonight is the New York Public Library. And if you want more great reads on American politics, here are some suggestions from that partner. And also remember, you can always read more from John Nichols in The Nation. Think of The Nation as your progressive companion in our polarized world. The Nation, we're working for change under every president. Join the fight today by subscribing at thenation.com/system check subs. How many times do we sometimes have to do that?
I know, all the time.
System check listeners will get 60% off their first year subscription. So subscribe today.
Well, Melissa, you'll remember when we first started talking about launching our new podcasts, we knew that we wanted to tackle numerous systems that produce and reinforce inequality and injustice, but we couldn't decide. We were debating it for a while. Were those systems broken and need to be fixed, or were they functioning exactly as they were designed? And this is one of the reasons why we're looking forward to an important new book available next month from the New Press. In his new book, Freedom from the Market, America's Fight to Liberate Itself from the Grip of the Invisible Hand, author Mike Konzel argues that our economic system is designed to create inequality. And so we asked the question, should we allow the free market to determine our lives? Well, we asked Mike, who is director of progressive thought at the Roosevelt Institute and a regular contributor to The Nation. We asked Mike to tell us a little bit about how his new book responds to this question, and he sent us a brief video. So let's take a look.
Hello, my name is Mike Konzel. I'm a research director at the Roosevelt Institute and author of the new book, Freedom from the Market, out January 12th, 2021. I'm here to explain the top 5 reasons why freedom requires keeping us free from the market. The first is that the distribution of goods in a market economy do not match what we need to lead free lives. Things like health, education, even time need to be allocated to people in ways that are not dependent on our ability to pay for them. 2 is that the market is an unreliable provider of many of these key goods. They both fail individually through profound market failures, but they also fail when taken together in times of depression, recession, and this pandemic we're living through. 3 is that freedom requires keeping us free from the arbitrary power and domination from others. This is no less true in the workplace and the marketplace more generally. Indeed, historically, the workplace and the marketplace have been sites of huge historical struggle to define freedom through limiting the power of bosses, owners, and the market itself. 4th is that the market tends to commodify things and does not reward things that cannot turn a profit. This is very unfortunate, as all of society requires a level of care and social reproduction and infrastructure that requires investment that capitalism in the market cannot provide. It can only borrow against these until they're depleted and we all suffer. And last is that in the same way we ask whether or not the actions of the government can help or hinder freedom, we need to ask the same thing in the marketplace, because the marketplace is a creation of the government. Markets are entirely a state project. They're a projection through laws, through regulations, through practices, through enforcement of things in ways and practices in which the government has set them up. As such, we need to ask whether or not the government is setting up markets in a way that enhance freedom, rather than the way they've been redesigning them in the last 50 years to primarily benefit owners and bosses and the rich. If you find these arguments persuasive, or even if you hate them and really want to engage them deeper, I hope you check out the book, which tells this story through historical battles, ranging from the 8-hour workday to the creation of Social Security, and through things you may not know as much about, things like World War II daycares and the way Medicare desegregated Southern hospitals. Each of these historical struggles not only are about a battle and a set of people who were trying to put limits on the marketplace, but also explains how they did so under a vision of freedom that I think is all the more relevant out here in the 21st century. I hope you check it out.
Thank you so much, Mike Konzel. And we're going to move to our next author who's joining us. We have 2 more left, so stay with us, everybody. Now, our next selection offers a very different way of thinking about systems. And although this book is about one man, and I quote, "It is not a biography. It builds on and extends history by considering him a collective rather than singular, and contends with who he became rather than who he was, end quote. Athlete, artist, philosopher, activist Paul Robeson is arguably the most talented man of the 20th century. And he's the subject of a brand new book by Shana Redman. Shana is professor of musicology and African American studies at UCLA. Her 2020 book from Duke University Press is entitled Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson. Professor Redman, and you will correct me if I got your name wrong. Welcome to System Check Book Club, Shauna.
Thank you so much.
I've only ever read all your work all these years. I've been following your career from the very beginning, and I think maybe we've only met once or twice briefly. But yes, but so excited for this book. I am a Paul Robeson fan, and thank you for joining the book club.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's really nice not only to see you, Dorian, again for the second time, and to meet you officially, Melissa, but also to have followed the discussion of Henry Wallace, because Robeson stumped for Wallace in 48 and was to Wallace, I guess, as Killer Mike was to Bernie Sanders.
What? Well, can you go there, because tell us a little bit about who Paul Robeson was, and for those who don't know, and why would he be stumping for Henry Wallace?
So Paul Robeson, the title of the book, Everything Man, is only minimally tongue-in-cheek. He really was everything and to everyone, right? So I'm pulling out all of these quotes throughout the book, which is arguing, as his wife does to open the book, that everything and everyone wanted him everywhere, right? That he was being called by these masses of people who were struggling against colonialism, who were fighting for workers' rights, who were fighting for a socialist-inspired democracy. And he starts to stump for Wallace in 48 before he becomes a villain of the state, even as that kind of profile is escalating, as the surveillance of him is escalating due to his work as an anti-colonial insurgent abroad and domestically, the ways in which he's using his stage work, his craft work, in films, in theater, in music, to actually rail against the state through uses of the Negro spirituals, through taking on and kind of displaying for the world the iconic lives of people like John Henry. All of these things are bringing attention from the surveillance state, both in the UK and in the United States. But by 1948, he's very solidly situated within a civil rights left in the United States, a labor left in the United States and globally, and decides that the Progressive Party, a third party option, is the best opportunity for reaching the goals that he saw as necessary for our liberated futures.
So, Shauna, you do something extraordinary in this book. And I want to really emphasize for folks, this is not a biography of Robeson, right? Certainly, if you don't know who Robeson is, you will come to know more from having read it. But what I love about it for inclusion in this book club is that you read Robeson as a system, right? So instead of as simply the individual, as the system. So for those who haven't read it, or even for those of us who have, but were challenged by the complexity of the language and the argument, can you walk us through this idea of Robeson as both element and vibration?
So I start the book, or the purpose of the book is really to talk about the ways in which he's called back, the ways in which he becomes usable for people, that he does become a system, a technology of sorts that allows people to think and do and act as they otherwise may not, for him not being present. And so I discuss a number of situations during his lifetime, but much of the book happens beyond his physical animation. It happens post 1976, which is the year in which he passes away. And I'm trying to think about all of the ways that he returns to us through recorded musics, through the built environment, and the book tracks him in as ascending in scale. So I start with the preface, which is around the element, kind of the raw materials of his person that make for such a fantastic, spectacular specimen. And then I move on to vibration. And I think what was really important for me was to really ground very solidly his musical practice, because quite often he's kind of lionized in the left due to his political speeches and having shown up for people. But my argument is that we don't know his politics without without knowing his instrument.
Mm.
We actually don't know his politics without listening to the music, because that's the reason he was there in the first place. They called him to perform, and the speech and the thought and the theorizations that came from it were secondary to the types of political work that he saw himself doing as a musician, as kind of a physical instrument, a singer, but also an instrument of the people. And so I track that often through his musical performances, but also through his development into sculpture, his development into art installation, but then also his ascendance to the shape of a mountain. So there is a mountain peak in Kyrgyzstan that's named Mount Paul Robeson. And I kind of end the project by thinking about him kind of ascending to summit, and what does it mean for him to still be a permanent artifact within our contemporary geopolitical landscapes. But he is someone who...
I will also note that you give an absolutely crushing and devastating analysis to the stamp, Paul Robeson as the grinning American stamp versus the intense and serious artist. I mean, I'm about to just do all the things with that in class.
Well, this is the thing. He did not want to, he wasn't a symbol. That is not what he wanted for his life. He wanted to actually be materially useful to people, right? And I have this amazing quote from Ossie Davis in the book, who wrote about him shortly after he passed away. And he says that the question of Paul Robeson for Black people is not a matter of fancy. And I'm paraphrasing here. It's a matter of life and death. Right? Knowing this person is a matter of life and death. After everything he gave, and he says that, you know, he gave and gave and gave, and we took and took and took, right? And this is what he wanted for his life. He saw himself as, in some respects, an offering to people. And so the stamp, where he's smiling and pacified, but his name is emblazoned in red, right? Always red. Was a moment of attempting to really struggle with how he's been pacified by the State Department that so readily, so willingly vilified him throughout his life.
Shauna, can you actually explain that? You said his name is always emblazoned in red. Why don't you spell that out for us?
So Paul Robeson, right, was someone who lost his passport in 1950. It was revoked by the State Department because of the kind of pervasiveness of the McCarthyite government, right? He was argued to be a communist, and famously was brought before the HUAC committee more than once, and would plead the fifth in response to the question of, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And that was his stand against both the Inquisition, but also the fact of standing firmly in his belief that his political affiliation was none of the government's business. And so the fact that he was always labeled a red, that his concerts were constantly disrupted, 1949 in Peekskill, where violence breaks out due to the Ku Klux Klan and other white nationalist organizations, due to the kind of pervasive whisper of his communist affiliation throughout the United States, was something that always attends to his memory, is that he was a red diaper baby. And whether he was or not, of course he was, wink, wink, it was for him not the business of anyone, but those with whom he chose to share it.
Shauna Redmond, first of all, thank you for writing the book that I am giving to my father-in-law for the holidays this year, largely because of, for every reason, but also because you describe Robeson's ear as pentatonic and say that he has an F-sharp epistemology. And genuinely, it was my father-in-law who even taught me those words about the black keys on the piano. So I'm so grateful for this book. It is an extraordinary offering. And thank you for joining us on the System Check Book Club.
So happy to be here, and many congratulations on the new podcast.
Thank you. And we'll see you hopefully in person in 2021.
I would love that, please.
If you want to learn more about Paul Robeson, who is one of my favorite humans of all time, if not the I think he is. And it struck me because I was born the year he died. So I've always had a fascination with him. People forget he went to Columbia Law School. I am a Paul Robeson junkie, Melissa. So if you want to learn more about Paul Robeson, Check out these suggested texts from our partner, the New York Public Library. And with that, we have just one book left to discuss. And this is our first System Check Book Club. And Melissa and I are so grateful that you took some time out of your weekend to hang out with us, to be nerdy, to talk books, check in with the System of Ideas, to do all the things. We hope you will subscribe to System Check Podcast and continue.
Please subscribe.
Part of the System Check community. And you can, of course, find us on all the places, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the Nation website, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like our show.
You can email Dorian and I directly. We'll send you a link to subscribe. Like, seriously, text us, subscribe.
Rate it. Also rate. And if you do like the show, yes, subscribe and review it and rate it. And it might not seem like it's a big deal, but it kind of is a big deal if you actually go and write a review or rate it. So with that, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome our next and final guest. Anna Malika Tubbs is a PhD candidate in sociology at Cambridge University and the author of a forthcoming book, The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped the Nation. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so cool to see my book in your hands. It's
great. It's lovely. Well, I laughed when we were, sort of putting it all together. And I said, of course, we're going to end on someone who's finishing their PhD. Because Dorian and I started becoming friends when we were finishing our PhDs. So
I love
full circle moment.
Yeah, no, it's like no pressure on my behalf. Everybody else already has theirs, but I'll keep up. I'll try my best.
We got your back. So
Thank you.
I was struck. I know Melissa was too, but I think you might have heard. I just became a father recently, and I was struck with. Thank you with how you begin the book, with the story of finding out that you're pregnant for the first time, and that conducting the research for this book while becoming a mother was a really powerful experience. So, how do you see the lives of these mothers connected to the challenges facing Black mamas today in 2020, heading into 2021?
Absolutely. So I started the project, during my PhD before I was pregnant. So I was already going to honor these Black women. I already wanted to speak to what was happening in the United States around Black motherhood, Black maternal health crisis, like you mentioned. And then to become pregnant while I was writing it and have those very real fears that come along with every motherhood experience, but especially for Black women in the United States, where we know that we're almost sacrificing our lives, that when we're talking about systems, you go into a healthcare system that was built by experimenting on the bodies of enslaved women. And it still is operating in that way today, where we're told that our pain levels are not taken as seriously, where if a Black woman says something is wrong when she's in the middle of her labor or even throughout her pregnancy, that she might not be believed. And this happens regardless of education levels. It happens regardless of socioeconomic status, whether you're a famous person or not. And so to be well aware of that, to be a scholar, a Black feminist scholar, and to know these things, and then find myself pregnant, both excited and very afraid, it gave me a lot of comfort to be talking about these three women, to be exploring their lives, and to just know that I was going to be okay, that yes, these systems were operating and trying to maybe destroy me, maybe just destroy my future child. But I was also part of a long legacy of Black women who had fought against that, who had responded against that. And I was going to learn from them. So it was an incredible honor to write the book while becoming a mother. And especially now that my son is here, it's given me all of the support that I've needed. And I hope that it provides that for other Black women as well.
So you draw on legacy not only of these three women and not only of the systems, which as you just gave us sort of in your analysis there around public health, but you also draw on the wisdom of many others, including Audre Lorde. A quote from Audre Lorde starts part 4 of your book. And the quote is, "Raising Black children, female and male, in the mouth of a racist, sexist, suicidal dragon is perilous and chancy. If they cannot love and resist at the same time, they will probably not survive. This is what mothers teach: love, survival, that is self-determination, and letting go." When you look at the stories of these three women, how did they do this chancy, perilous work in the mouth of this racist, sexist dragon?
Absolutely. I mean, I think with these three women, one of the heartbreaking parts of the book is we know how the story ends with their three sons. We know that each of the women is going to live to see her son die, to see her son either be celebrated or vilified by many. And so to know that from the very beginning, but experience them as the women they are before they have their children, to see them give birth to these children, to hold their little boys near and dear to their hearts, and to know that they are still going to sacrifice this life for the sake of their country, for the sake of their nation, is so powerful and so emotional. And we see the humanity that goes into it. But at all different points in the book, we also see that they're not going to keep their children, not only these famous sons, but all of their children, from whatever their path is supposed to be, from whatever God calls them to be, depending on what their faith was. They knew they had to support that. They knew that they had to teach their children to join them in their fight for their humanity and our community. And so they had to let go. They had to believe that it was going to be for something greater, something bigger than themselves. And they did that for us. And I think there are so many Black mothers today, whether that's biological mothers, non-biological mothers, those that are nourishing us with their work, with all these different forms of creation that I'm celebrating in this book. It's time that we also honor that sacrifice, but make it less of a sacrifice, make it less work for each of these women. It doesn't have to be the way it is. You know, we don't have to keep losing people. We don't have to keep sacrificing people if more people can listen to us from the very beginning and start to see the world in the way we see it for ourselves.
And of course, the story that you just told, a story of woman who becomes mother, and we know how it ends, is exactly the moment that, at least for people who are in the Christian faith, we find ourselves in the moment of Advent. And that is, in fact, exactly where we are, right? We are waiting, again, in the season of Advent, in the holiday season, for a birth where we know what the end is going to be. And yet you ask us to look away from just the baby child and up towards the mother. And in fact, I think what I remember the phrase that you used earlier is, no one's even bothered to be curious, right? That these were women who it should have been easy to ask a question about, and yet folks did not even bother to be curious. I wonder how many people watching know that Dr. King's mother was killed by a gunshot, that she too was shot to death. Like, I wonder how many even know that sort of historical fact. How do we get people to be curious about the lives of Black mamas?
Absolutely. I think for me, it's even saying a basic thing, like we celebrate MLK Day, that's his birthday. And we don't stop to think about who birthed him. Right. There on this very important day. That's ridiculous.
Yes, Dorian, new daddy, right? Remember, the birthday is her party.
Exactly, it is 100%. I celebrate myself on my son's birthday as well. I did a lot of work. And the fact that no one has thought about them. I mean, there's few scholars. I'm not the first to do it. And I'm joining some others who believe that we need to shine light on these incredible women. But it is shocking. And I really hope that the book has that emotion for people, that you are shocked when you learn these details, when you learn that Alberta King was also killed and that her life has not been given the honor that it deserves. When you learn that Louise Little was a radical Black feminist activist. And it's no wonder that Malcolm X ended up this way, when his mother, while she's pregnant with him, is standing up, literally standing up to the KKK. When she herself is put in an institution for 25 years of her life against her will. And she fully believed it was because she was a woman, a single Black woman who wanted to own her own land and raise her children without being dependent on the state. And so there's all these parallels, even Burtis Baldwin and the principals of James School saying it's clear that he got his writing talent from her. So it's not even like I'm making this big stretch. You know, obviously all of our mothers like influenced us in some way or another. So that would have been a story regardless. But with these three women, it's direct connections in hundreds of ways. And it's shocking that we didn't know that beforehand. And it makes it clear that it's quite intentional to erase these stories. We've talked about their fathers multiple times. And I even talk about this in the book. Even as I gave birth to a son, my husband was congratulated more on the birth of his son than I was congratulated, as if women cannot raise men. You know, this constant notion and this gendered and very sexist idea, when the reality is we're all playing a role in our children's lives. And Black women have played a very particular role because we have been told legally throughout history that we were givers of non-life, givers of property. That was written in the law. And so that's why I specifically wanted to focus on Black motherhood, the way we've given life even when others told us we couldn't.
Anna Malaika Tubbs, thank you for this book. Thank you for your research. Please say hello to your husband. And that's not because not because he's a man.
That's just because he's the homie.
He's the homie. We really appreciate the work that he does, but I also so much, and I so appreciate that your voice is here to say, always look up from the baby, always look beyond the boy in the room. Let's ask questions and be curious about Black mamas. And yes, we're very excited about this book. And we know that it's going to be a big hit next year.
Thank you. It means so much coming from both of you. I am such a fan, so I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Dorian.
Hey.
I think we did it.
You sure? Don't we have 6 more books?
Well, you remember how long the list was initially, but I think we did it. And I just want to say thank you to all of our authors. It is not a small thing to get a call on fairly short notice in the middle of the holiday season to spend time talking to us, to send us our videos. Also, thank you to all of the amazing, fabulous publishers who had these little books just come into my house. I so appreciate it. It was like early Christmas every single day. I got another book. So thank you so much for that.
And of course, a very special thanks to all of our partners, the Anna Julia Cooper Center, Community Change Action, the New York Public Library, the Tattered Covered Bookstore for sponsoring the event, and of course, the Homo System Check, The Nation magazine.
The Nation. And within these systems, the system, well, no, Angela Cooper Center is a system, but Community Change Action and New York Public Library and all of that, just some very special gratitude to our actual folks who are making all of this happen. First of all, our special event executive producer, Shanta Covington. Thank you for all of your leadership and capacity. To our podcast executive producer, Frank Reynolds, thank you for being the homie all throughout all of this. To Crystal Dixon, Jamie Crockett, and Miller Coffee from the Anna Julia Cooper Center. I love working with y'all every single time.
And of course, from Community Change Action, our deepest appreciation to Ingrid, Zelaya Asensio, and Carmen Orozco Acosta on our team here. Thank you, as well as Marisol Bello. Thank y'all. Thank you, Community Change family. I really, really appreciate y'all.
Because for real, without them, this would literally just be an actual phone call, just Dorian and I talking. So it's only looking pretty because of those folks. I just want you also to remember, everybody who's still with us at this moment, you can find all the books from our book club at thenation.com/systemcheck.
And of course, remember to subscribe to System Check wherever you find your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get them. You can find them all the episodes, also at the website at thenation.com/systemcheck. And Melissa, happy holidays.
Happy holidays. The next time I see you, I would like us to be much less sober. No more tea and coffee. We will have a little look at the families together via Zoom with a glass of our favorites. Thanks for making the end of 2020 livable and wonderful. And I cannot wait to keep checking systems with you in 2021.
Same here. Much love to you, Melissa, to the family.
And kiss that baby.
I'm about to go kiss that baby.
Bye, everybody.